Oh my gosh, big news, everyone. So, just after chatting to Golnara and seeing her excellent productivity video, I had a look on Facebook. I noticed that JM was complaining that he was looking for work. On top of that, I saw his LinkedIn was updated and he was looking for certain types of jobs. And I want to know what happened, right? JM's a good friend of mine. He's a good man. He mowed lawns well, but something's gone wrong. And we want to explain that here. So let's get underway. When we're looking at JM's situation, we're talking about a person who is facing unemployment. JM is actively looking for work but is not currently working. Now, when we're in that situation, what could have been the drivers that led him there, given he was previously employed? It could have been a situation that the economy went into a downturn. And due to that downturn, consumers of his lawn mowing product stopped purchasing. Now, in normal times, they would have purchased his product, but in this instance, they haven't just because of the economic downturn. A second possibility is all the fancy robots that Gawley was talking about at the end of her productivity video. A new robot lawnmower has come onto the scene, and people can buy that and no longer need JM to mow lawns for them. If that robot lawnmower is cheaper, then he doesn't have demand for his product anymore, and he needs to find other work. A third thing that happens is that it turns out our friend JM is actually John Maynard Keynes, the famous economist from during the Great Depression. Given he realizes he's that person again, and he realizes he has a PhD in philosophy, specializing in political science and economics, he decides he wants a job that matches those skills. Skills he's not using while he mows lawns. Now, all three of these would explain the Facebook post that I saw from JM, but they have specific different names. The first situation is termed cyclical unemployment. Cyclical unemployment is when the economic cycle, so downturns and upswings, lead to changes in demand for labor, and those changes in demand for labor lead to unemployment. Now, some of this change in demand will be held by the firm because the firm will want to keep hold of their workers. But if a firm is facing liquidity pressures, or if they're uncertain about the future, they will lay people off who they wouldn't have laid off in normal circumstances. Because of that, cyclical unemployment seems like the type of failure we would want to try to avoid. The structural unemployment is not something we would want to avoid per se when it comes to this robot. As we've noted, the cost of mowing lawns is now lower. We would like consumers to pick things that have a lower cost in terms of the resources they are using. But my friend JM, if he loses his job in this way, he wants to still mow lawns, he enjoys mowing lawns, and now he can't mow lawns anymore. He has skills that are stranded, and this is costly for him. So this is a concerning type of unemployment for that individual, and how we handle that is a difficult problem because on the consumer side, the changes and technological benefits involved are beneficial. Our third type of unemployment was actually sort of a choice by JM. JM noted that he had skills and expertise that would be better utilized elsewhere, and so he's left his job to give himself time to search for new work. This frictional unemployment is incredibly common in the economy and is actually a positive type of unemployment in some ways. Now, that's a nice characterization of types of unemployment, but how separate are these things? If JM, John Maynard Keynes, decides to find an economics job but has a lot of trouble finding one over time, he could go from frictionally unemployed to structurally unemployed. People may view his skills and say, we don't think you're quite necessary for this job, and he'll get stuck there. Similarly, if there's been a downturn in demand, JM might find himself moving from being cyclically unemployed to structurally unemployed if he stays out of work for a long time. So these characterizations are useful for thinking about problems, and for different questions, they'll have a different amount of use. Now, to figure out what to do, we want to look at a bunch of measures relating to unemployment, how we measure it, and how we can measure these different types of unemployment, and see if we can use them to think about what unemployment means. When we measure unemployment, we use a very specific definition, and you'll see the important terms I've highlighted here in blue. Are you willing to work at the current wage right now? And are you taking active steps to do so? So here we're asking about a person who is willing to work. So they're not working. Well, double negative. It's not that they're not working. And they're sitting there just enjoying alcohol, having fun, partying, retired perhaps. In that sort of circumstance, they just wouldn't be in the labor market. They are willing right now to look for a job. And that job is at the current market wage. They're not saying I'm willing to work if someone gave me $1 million an hour. They are specifically willing to work at wages that are available now, and they're willing to do it right now. They're not saying I'm willing to work in a year's time. They're actually willing to provide their labor now. The active steps part is saying that we need you to show us that this is believable. Are you actually searching for a job, or are you just reporting that you would be willing to work for some way? Now, when we ask this type of question, we'll get people that are willing to work but not at the wage, people that are willing to work at the wage but not right now, people that are taking active steps, but those steps aren't really real because they're not really willing to work, and they'll report us all sorts of different things. So when we go to measure it, we use a household survey that tries to capture all these concepts. We ask people about it, and if they note that they are willing to work at the current wage right now and taking active steps, we get our unemployment number. Now, we can't really use this to split things into those components neatly. If we look at the split, if we asked a person, are you frictionally unemployed? They'll stare at us blankly because that's quite a technical sounding term. Furthermore, the perspective of the household on why they were made unemployed isn't necessarily an objective reflection on what happened with them. So we have to rely on other data. If we want to ask about cyclical unemployment, we need to look at GDP, and we need to ask ourselves if we're facing an economic cycle. If we're trying to compare structural or frictional unemployment, we'll want to ask about the length of time people have been searching for to understand whether this looks like standard job search or whether someone is really mismatched from the labor market. In that way, we have to form a view based on these types of indicators. A common one to look at is the time of search one. Over here, we have the duration of unemployment for people who are currently unemployed in New Zealand. You'll see a lot of people are only unemployed for less than 3 months. This could be someone quitting their job and then going and looking for 3 months just to find something that catches their fancy. But once we start seeing people unemployed for 6 months, 12 months, more than a year, it starts to feel like they're not just leaving their job to search, they're in a position where they're struggling to find work and struggling to have their skills match with a job. In that way, we start to feel that as we move towards longer periods of displacement, those people are more structurally unemployed. So when we use that characterization, we'll often be looking about points in time. But this isn't a perfect match. In Australia, anyone that's unemployed for more than a month is said to be structurally unemployed rather than frictionally unemployed. In New Zealand, people often term this 3 to 6 months. I've heard some countries say 12 months to 18 months. Different countries have different definitions because they have different labor markets, different cultural norms about how to search, and different understandings on how these things work. When we think about structural unemployment, though, we had a certain technological shock. JM, our friend, was trying to compete, but he couldn't compete against the magical, mystical robot lawnmowers. Given that, anyone who's trying to mow lawns would now have to earn a lower wage to compete with those robots. So changes in relative wage rates for different tasks and different types of jobs can give us an indication that something has happened on the structural side. In this way, we would want to look at wage data to understand what happens with structural unemployment. And this is something that sometimes gets forgotten about. During the global financial crisis, a lot of people talked about structural unemployment, but wage growth was weak for all industries. Given that, it didn't look like we had structural unemployment. Instead, we had a prolonged downturn that looked more like cyclical unemployment. So these differences sound technical, but they're incredibly important for us understanding what is happening to people in the economy and how they're being affected by it. Now, we're going to use JM's experience to try to figure out what other measures we could use to understand what is going on with JM and what's going on with the labor market. So, if JM has left his job and no one will hire him, what's he going to do when he's phoned up for the household survey? On the phone, it sounds like it's a beautiful woman or man, and he wants to impress that person. Furthermore, he's an economist, so he's got a ridiculous amount of pride and ego. Given that, how does this work? How does he respond? Well, he might well say that even though he is searching for work, he's not. He might tell them, look, I'm not looking for a job right now. I'm fine. I'm happy as I am. I'm happy to not be in work. It's like a holiday. This is called the discouraged worker effect. If JM was doing this when he's phoned up, he won't turn up as unemployed because he's a discouraged worker. Now, what can we do with the data to find people like this? We can ask ourselves, are people who are able to actually turning around and looking for work? The numbers we'll look at here are the participation rate and the employment rate. If the employment rate as a percentage of the total working age population is low, and our unemployment rate looks low, then this suggests that there's a lot of people saying that they are not unemployed when actually they are. So given that, we can use this measure to figure out if there are discouraged workers. If we look at the United States after the global financial crisis, it looks like there were a lot of discouraged workers. And in 2018 and 2019, when employment rates shot up, it looked like a lot of those people finally found work. It's great. In New Zealand, on the other hand, our employment rates and participation rates are always very high. So it doesn't look like we had the same level of discouraged workers, which shows good policy making, but also a fortunate situation for us. Now, what happens if JM does find a job, but it's a part-time lecturing job when he wants to be lecturing full-time, researching full-time, deeply involved in the university, spreading his book about the general theory? Well, in this case, we have a potentially underutilized employee. It doesn't mean that there's underutilization here because the market itself might only be willing to hire someone like JM part-time. It might turn out that there's only work for part-time lecturers now, and there is no longer work for full-time lecturers. But if it's because of what he's been through, if there is a situation where employers would be willing to offer him a full-time job, but because of his situation, he's gotten stuck in part-time work, he would be underutilized. And if there was an increase in demand for lecturers, he would just be able to provide more hours. Well, how do we measure that? Well, we ask people, do they want to work more hours? There are two measures that come out of this. In New Zealand, we have a thing called the underutilization rate, where we add on these people who want to work more hours to the unemployment rate, and it gives another number. In the United States, they call this the U6 rate. Amongst their 6 different unemployment measures, this is the broadest, and it captures these people who would be willing to work full-time, but are unable to. Now, I haven't actually found out what's happening with JM, and after talking it all through with you, I feel like I understand what could have happened, and I'm just going to wait till he's comfortable enough to come and talk to me. In a similar vein, if you have friends that you feel are struggling with unemployment in some way, just recognize it is a big life shock, whether it was due to their own choices or not, and be sympathetic about it. Now, I hope we all understand unemployment a bit more and how it fits into these different measures and fits into some of our understanding of economics. But we're just going to leave it there, and we'll chat to you another time. Bye-bye.